Bowsie. How you feeling, girl? How are you? Huh? How you feeling, baby? How you feeling, good girl? You're really starting to loosen up under there. That's good. Hey everybody, Sonic Blue here with Bowsie the Bearded Dragon, and she is so happy today because we are going to be talking about the shedding cycles of a bearded dragon, and it's very coincidental that I chose this topic to talk about this week because this is also the same week Bowsie is finally shedding all of those old scales, see? And so what a perfect opportunity to talk about this and let everybody know that well, number one, Bowsie is super happy. Yes, you are happy, aren't you, good girl? Yeah. And number two, that this is a very important subject matter to deal with if you don't know anything about raising a bearded dragon. When you have a juvenile bearded dragon, you will notice that they will start to rub their noses and their snouts against anything they can find that's rough. Usually their basking stick, a log, a cave, some decorations in their terrariums, if they have them. And that just means that they're in the early stages of shedding. Usually, give or take about a couple of days later, you're going to start to see some loose scales coming up off their heads, or it could be on their backs, on their legs, on their feet, on their tail. The funny thing about shedding on bearded dragons is that the shedding process is always going to be sporadic, meaning that parts of the bearded dragon don't all shed together. Sometimes the head will shed first, sometimes the back will shed first, sometimes the underbelly will shed first, sometimes the arms and the legs will shed first. But it eventually will take over the entire body to where you will start to see a lot of shedding going on, and we got a lot of shedding here as well. And this is a relief because I was beginning to wonder when Bowsie was going to be shedding her scales. When they get to be about adult size like this here, where they're not going to get any bigger, their shedding cycles will appear less and less. And to the point where you're going to wonder if they are ever going to shed again at all. And the answer is yes, they will continue to shed, but not as often as they would if they were still growing. But they will still shed because Bowsie is living proof. She's almost 4 years old. She's done all the growing she can possibly do, and she will still continue to shed. So, but one of the things I wanted to touch on the subject of, mainly, what should you do when your bearded dragon starts shedding? Well, first of all, you definitely don't want to handle them too much, and this is an exception, well, because Bowsie wanted to be picked up, and she kind of looked over at me and had those eyes in her head saying, "Daddy, please come get me." So, and for the purpose of this vlog, I wanted to get her while the time was right. So she's not as upset being handled as much as she would have been, though, if she were younger and shedding, because bearded dragons, especially when they're younger, will be moody as ever when they start to shed. And that means that it's best to just leave them alone, let them do the shedding cycle, and try not to handle them too much. But always remember to keep them hydrated as much as possible. And as your bearded dragon gets older, they will discover what the water is there for, and they will start to venture into the water, start dunking into the water, swimming around in the water, and that usually helps keep their scales nice and hydrated, so that way the shedding process isn't as uncomforting as it could be. But for a desert animal, especially bearded dragons, shedding process is very irritating to your bearded dragon, but they all have to do it. So this is one of the reasons why they get so moody when they go through a shedding cycle. It's because it's very irritating. A lot of them don't like to do it. A lot of them feel very upset. You'll feel that sometimes your bearded dragon just isn't his or herself. And that's mainly because they're going through a shedding, they're going to feel a little miserable, but the best thing that you can do for them is just keep them hydrated. Mist them as many times as you can during the shedding process as well, and that will help them out. If they don't jump in their water, you can always give them a misting. Now, outside of shedding cycles, it's best to mist them at least once or twice a week, but while they're shedding, do it once a day. I always try to do it once a day if they don't hop into their own water and start swimming about. And that's what Bowsie did all morning this morning. She was swimming around, she was dunking herself, she was playing in the water. She came out, she went onto her basking stick, she came back in the water later, started swimming around again, came back out. So it was a back and forth all day today. And I finally realized that she's starting to lose a lot of her scales, and her old scales are coming off finally. Now, should you ever help a bearded dragon's shedding? This is a very touchy subject because sometimes you have to, but other times it's not necessary. Most cases, it's not necessary. The only thing that you can really do is keep them hydrated. That's your priority as a bearded dragon owner. Keep them hydrated and keep that scale moist. Now, it's perfectly normal to have dry scales some of the time. You're not always going to be constantly misting them. Just mist them once a day, they'll be just fine. But you definitely want to keep their hydration level up than you normally would under normal circumstances. And this basically reduces the irritation they feel and the misery that they go through in their shedding cycle. But sometimes it is necessary for them to be dry as well. So you kind of have to fluctuate the moisture / dryness throughout the entire day. So if you miss them once a day, that's perfect. You're doing the best that you can for your bearded dragon right there. But should you ever need to help with a bearded dragon's shedding, actually taking them off for them? And the answer, no. Well, yes and no. Let me go over this. In most cases, bearded dragons can shed all of their scales on their own. But sometimes it gets stuck and you need a little bit of help to get the rest of that off of there. For instance, like when it gets closer to the tip of the tail, or when the loose scales don't really fully come off of the spikes on the side of their bodies very well. And you can actually help that along, but by very carefully placing your finger underneath where the loose scale is, and sort of just giving it a gentle push, like you're just stroking it gently. And this will help ease those scales right off. You don't want to tear it off, you don't want to take it off, and you definitely don't want to do anything that will harm your bearded dragon, and doing that will, especially towards the tail tip. Now, when you get closer to the tail tip in the sheddings, it's very difficult for them to get those loose scales off because of how compacted they are together towards the end of the tail. Let me just demonstrate if Bowsie will allow me. The softer the scales are, basically from here down to here, and anywhere in between the bottom of the head and the base of the tail, are going to be the softest parts of the bearded dragon. Why? Because the scales aren't as compacted as they are when you get closer to the tail tip. And when you feel down here, you can feel that the scales are more compacted and a lot more tighter. And this, therefore, will make it very difficult for your bearded dragon to shed comfortably. So sometimes you may need to help them along a little bit. But remember, do not ever force any loose scales off their bodies. If it don't come off, it won't come. But you have to let that come off naturally, and sometimes it requires the use of some of the loose scales to help get the rest of it off their bodies. And that's why we don't really help them along, is because the more shed scales and the more loose scales they got, the more will come up. But if you were to say, like, take all of these loose scales that she's got right now and sort of trim them down, then the rest of the shedding may not happen. So you need to leave those alone and let them happen naturally. And if by doing so, you may have an irritated dragon for a little bit longer of a time than expected, but it is better for your bearded dragon's shedding cycle nonetheless in the long run. And Bowsie is very happy today. I don't know what you're smiling about because you're shedding like crazy. But she's just happy being out with Daddy, and she's probably used to being shedding, because she's almost going to be 4 years old, so you're probably used to shedding. But you're probably relieved knowing that all of those old scales are finally coming off your body, huh? Isn't that right, baby girl? And I see some loose scales around your mouth there, too. Yep, that'll be coming up soon, too. You may also notice, too, that some parts of your bearded dragon will discolor. They will become a brighter color, maybe even a different shade of color, especially around the sides here where their spikes are. If they're starting to become a lot lighter in color, and that just basically means that their loose scales are about ready to come off. So you definitely want to monitor them, at least, watch over them, make sure that they're having a decent shedding. But like I said, you can help them along. There's one particular part in helping them along that's kind of necessary, and this is where the yes and no part comes into play, especially regarding their nostrils. Now, how to determine when a bearded dragon is about ready to shed from their nostrils is quite simple. You will notice that, especially when they get to be about time for them to shed on their head, you will notice that their nostril, the skin around their nostril will come loose. And when you start to see that, you may want to very gently with a fingernail get up underneath where it is loose and help pry the nostril right off of there. And you'll notice there will be some excess scales inside the nostril that'll come out as well. It's almost like picking their nose. But it's gruesome, it's gross, I know, but sometimes you have to be doing gross things in order to help your bearded dragon, and especially when it comes time to shed their head. And you want to make sure you pay particular attention to their nostrils, because that is technically a breathing orifice for your bearded dragon. Although they do have their ear canals, they have their mouths, so they have plenty of orifices which they breathe from, but this is another source they use to intake air, and you really don't want to obstruct that. So, and having a loose scale there is kind of like having a stuffed up nose, and you really want to clear that out of there. Well, the same goes for bearded dragons, only it's not really mucus for us, but it's scales to them. So you definitely want to clear that out as well. So keep a good watch on the nose of your bearded dragon. If it starts to shed, then start paying particular attention to the nostril. And the sooner that you can get on top of that, the better. But you definitely want to be very careful in removing the loose scale from the nostril. But that is about the only part they really need help with, other than the tip of the tail, which, you know, they keep dragging their loose scales along and it just kind of drags along. You can actually help that along just very gently with your finger. Try to just kind of gently rub as gently as possible. You don't want to force anything off of them, and you definitely don't want to tear or rip off of their scales, because that's like almost like taking your skin and ripping a loose part of skin off and having some more skin come off in the process. That hurts like the devil, let me tell you, because I've done it before, and I've had like a hangnail or something, and when you try to take that off and it removes part of the skin, that is painful. And so that's the same thing that would happen if your bearded dragon were in the same situation. Just remember how bad that feels to get that hangnail with some loose skin attached to it, to have that just torn off your body. And you can definitely understand how it must feel for a bearded dragon. Now, for helping along with the shedding, the reason why we are so gentle, mainly because, well, you got to think about this too. They're going to be very irritated because they're shedding. A lot of them will feel miserable, very irritated. They won't probably want to hang out with you very often. Depends on the mood of your bearded dragon and what they're feeling. Because you got to understand too, a bearded dragon shedding, it's kind of like wearing the same clothes for about a year, and then finally when they're starting to fall apart on you, and just the way it feels on you, it would make you pretty miserable feeling too. So you got to understand how your bearded dragon feels about shedding as well, and then understand what they're going through. But if you keep them well hydrated and you keep a good watch on their shedding cycles, make sure they get an adequate amount of water, make sure that they're staying healthy, and make sure that they're not too angry about the situation. But if they are, just leave them alone, and they'll be fine once the shedding is over. But Bowsie's got quite a ways to go from her shedding cycle, and I can see more loose scales down here that she'll be very pleased about getting off of her body. So yeah, you are looking forward to your shedding, aren't you, baby? Aren't you, baby? Yeah, you're my baby girl. Yes, you are. Oh, and you're so happy. And doing these simple tests will make your bearded dragon just about as happy as Bowsie here. And she never ceases to amaze me on how happy she really is. And that could be the happiness that you get in return from proper care of your bearded dragon. So remember these tips. And if you have any questions whatsoever, leave them in a comment down below and get in touch with me, because I'd love to talk to you. If you got any problems raising your bearded dragon, let me know what they are. I've probably been through it, probably help you through it. But if we cannot help in solving your problem, that's what your veterinarian is for, one who specializes in exotic pets. So never forget the number of your veterinarian, and always remember, at the first sign of the lethargism, ill, or in this case, the shedding cycles doesn't turn out too well, then always consult with your veterinarian. They will be able to guide you in the right direction for the proper care of your bearded dragon at home. And for Bowsie's vlogs, I think that's all that we need to cover. Isn't that right, girl? You are so happy. You are so happy. A little anecdote, too. This morning I tried to do a film of Bowsie's vlogs, and you know how sometimes my audio doesn't sync up with my video, and it sounds like, like the sound cuts out and then it comes back in really low? Well, I hope to have rectified the situation, and so I did an earlier filming of Bowsie's vlogs, and I did a little. It was the cutest thing. Bowsie, I put her up like this while I did Bowsie's vlogs, and she went right up to my chin for a nuzzle. She wanted me to nuzzle her, and she wanted to get a lot of Daddy's nuzzles. And then when I thought she was done with the nuzzle, I pulled my chin away, and she says, no, 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 bring that back. And she actually followed with her head, put it back on my chin, and says, you got more nuzzling to do, Daddy. And I'm like, okay, I'll nuzzle you some more. And she was satisfied. She leaned into it, and she was gaping with me, and she just never ceases to amaze how loving she is. And a lot of herpetologists, I say once again, they say that bearded dragons have no emotion of love whatsoever, but that is not true. Bowsie is living proof that bearded dragons can and will love you back. You just have to teach them what love is, and you have to be patient with them, because Bowsie is almost 4 years old, and I have spent every single day of her life showing her what love means. And she knows what it means by now, and she gives it to me in lots and lots of, loving emotions that only a bearded dragon can give. Now, keep in mind, they're not going to love you like a dog or a cat, but, those are mammals. This is a reptile, and reptiles are very, very difficult to show any signs of affection. But if you can get one to show it to you, then that means that you have shown your pets lots of loving and lots of good care. And they know what that means, and they are not afraid to show that in return, now that they know what it means. And bearded dragons are very intelligent creatures, and they can learn really fast. Or in some cases, might take them some time. But once they get into a cycle, they repeat it every day. In fact, Bowsie still greets me in the morning with a nuzzle to my hand. Every single morning. And now she's getting tangled in my hair. Now, I might know a lot about bearded dragons, but granted, I don't know everything. One of the major things that I'm still trying to figure out is, why do bearded dragons like hair so much? This morning, she was eating on my hair, getting tangled in my hair, grabbing my hair. What is it about hair that you love, Bowsie? What is it? I really don't know. Maybe it's the way it feels. Maybe it's the way it smells that attracts them to it. And maybe it's basically, they think that it's food and they want to try to taste it. And they want, how the bearded dragons, they taste the air around them to get a feel of their environment. Well, bearded dragons will do this to your hair a lot, and it doesn't really mean that they're trying to eat your hair. They're just trying to taste your hair. They're trying to sense it, and they're trying to, figure you out. And they always get hair in their mouth, and they realize maybe that wasn't such a good idea after all. And I had to take a strand of my hair out of her mouth, and this was this morning when I filmed Bowsie's vlog the first time around. So that might not have anything to do with their shedding cycle, but it's a little anecdote I'd like to throw in there from what Bowsie did with me this morning, and I thought it was really adorable and cute. But above all, if you're good to your bearded dragon, if you're very loving and very caring to your bearded dragon, and you practice this with them and you teach them what that is, then they will be loving to you too. Just got to give them a lot of time and a lot of patience, and let them come to you, let their affections come around, and it always helps to interpret exactly what your bearded dragon is feeling, whether it's illness, whether it's lethargism, whether it's tiredness, whether it's happiness, or just whatever. Maybe they are in a blah type of feeling, but it always helps to interpret what your bearded dragon is feeling. And you can go back and look in one of my episodes where I touch on the subject of bearded dragon behaviors, and knowing what to tell in your bearded dragon by bearded dragon senses. And you can basically see the world through their eyes, and you can understand your bearded dragon, how they feel, through their body language. And bearded dragons especially are very boisterous creatures when it comes to body language. They are very, I wouldn't really want to say moody, but yes, they can be moody. But they can also be rich in personality. But anyway, that's about all that I have to share with you on Bowsie's Vlogs. There's one other thing that I did talk about on the previous video, and I started talking about the terrarium over there. I did recall, I was asked the question, what's the difference between a terrarium and a vivarium? A terrarium and a vivarium are both used to house a bearded dragon or a reptile of any kind. Let's just use reptile in general. A terrarium is a solid glass tank that you would find in a pet store. It looks almost like a fish tank, but not quite really formulated for holding that amount of water. But it is held together for the purpose of storing lizards, reptiles, snakes, amphibians, desert creatures like that. You're not going to put fish in a terrarium. It's just not built for that. Then there's a vivarium. A vivarium is basically built, custom made. It is a build of a combination of wood, mostly wood, and glass for the front of the panel. The rest of it will be built out of natural things they would find in their natural habitat, such as rocks, sand, branches, plants, trees, whatever you can find in the wild that they usually would associate the desert lifestyle with, would be in the vivarium. Vivarium, also being made out of wood, will help absorb a lot of that heat that comes in from the UVA bulbs, and a lot of that heat will be absorbed into either the balsa wood or the pine wood or whatever wood you happen to use. But balsa and pine are two of the more common woods used in vivarium building, and so that's the difference between a vivarium and a terrarium. Now, chances are it's very common for people to get a terrarium because that's what's available in pet stores. It's easier for them to obtain, doesn't cost them too much money, and they don't have to take measurements in their house to basically have one built custom made. A vivarium, on the other hand, are for the very experienced bearded dragon and reptile owners, because they'll know exactly where it's going to go, what it's going to look like, and what they want to have inside the vivarium, and they can build it made to order. And so vivariums are mostly for experienced bearded dragon or reptile owners in general. But terrariums are still good enough to have. You just really got to make sure that you take the necessary precautions in providing for their heat, their lighting, and, of course, husbandry, food, water, and decor would also help too. But that's about it for tonight's Bowsie's Vlogs. Tune in next time, and we'll find something else that we can talk about, but I'm sure it'll be educational. But don't forget, if you ever feel that your bearded dragon needs it, don't forget the number for your veterinarian, one who specializes in exotic pets, because they're worth it, and so are you. So lots of luck with your care of your bearded dragons out there, and I'll see you next time on Bowsie's Vlogs.